you gave members an update on the living wage. Where are you up to with it at this stage?
In the programme for government this year, we committed to paying all established posts inside government the living wage. We're going to be doing that, paying it from November, backdated to the 1st of April this year. Secondly, frustratingly in one sense, although we'll get over this, no living wage foundation has been established during the last year. So I announced in Tynwald last week that government in the Economic Affairs Unit would recalculate the Manx living wage in January to March next year, and then thereafter as long as it's needed.
And how does the calculation for the living wage differ from, say, the minimum wage?
Okay, the minimum wage is set under law, and there's a minimum wage committee that makes a recommendation to the Treasury Minister and the Minister for Enterprise each year. And the number that's come up with is having taken evidence from trade unions, from people, from employers, from Chamber of Commerce, from other employing federations, and it's a number that's negotiated, agreed. Differently, the living wage is voluntary, but it's calculated according to a precise formula. So essentially, there were focus groups held about what people think is the normal standard of living for different types of household grouping. So single women, single men, that's two groups, couples with one child, two children, three children, and so on. You work out what that basket of goods and services looks like for a normal standard of life. So it includes holidays and transport and all the things that people normally think is what you need to live to have a normal standard of life. And then that's costed. It's obviously much more to have children. Women, turns out, can live slightly more cheaply than men when they're single people. All that sort of information is presented in our report, and then the actual living wage on an hourly basis is calculated by adding up the price of those goods for each of the groups and then allocating proportionately depending on how many people are in each of those groups. So the living wage isn't what it costs for everybody to live, it's the average of single people and people with lots of children, so there are many, many differences. I don't know if that's clear enough, but in essence the living wage is calculated according to the normal standard of consumption. It's what's called the minimum income standard.
Do you have figures for how many people are actually being paid below what is set to be or deemed to be the living wage here in the Isle of Man?
Every June, July, we do an earnings survey. We launch one in June or July each year. We have the figures from 2017. We have the figures from 2016. In January, we'll have it for 2018. And between 2016 summer and 2017 summer, the amount of people earning lower than the living wage fell from 16% of those employed to 14% of those employed.
And how many of those work for government? I know you say you're going to backdate payments to people, but how many people are affected within government itself at the moment?
In terms of the permanent establishment, it's around 100, but then we do have lots of contractors and agency staff who, through their agents and the contractors, are earning lower than the living wage. So I don't want to say that everybody who receives public money is now will now be earning lower than the living wage. It's a separate question whether we change our procurement practices such that if you're working on a temporary basis or on an agency basis, whether or not you or a contracting basis, whether or not you have to be there. In some countries, Scotland for instance, London for instance, they've made the choice to become living wage employers where even contractors earn the living wage, but we haven't made that decision as yet in the Isle of Man.
That could certainly tie government's hands as to who they could deal with.
It would just raise the standards, because we have increased the minimum wage quite a lot in recent years. So this year that affected the contractors, for instance, for secretarial work and for another few categories of work, because the people providing us with staff had to increase pay rates to their staff because the minimum wage went up by so much.
But you say that the long-term aspiration would be to have a minimum wage which was, by its nature, set at what the living wage is. Mm-hmm. Are there any plans to change the living wage from a voluntary living wage to a mandatory one, to set it in law?
Yeah, well, David Cameron played tricks with language back in 2014-15 and called the minimum wage for people over 25, the national living wage. That's wrong. Living wage, the whole point of it is it's calculated mathematically according to minimum income standard, and it's voluntary. It's a scientific approach to working out how much it costs to live. The minimum wage is set in law. So the minimum wage could go up to what the living wage is calculated, but that's as far as we should go. We shouldn't mix up the concepts of voluntary versus legal.